all of you for coming today. What Sebastian had invited me to do was to talk for maybe about 20 minutes about the history of containment, particularly in the context of the current Sino-American relationship. What lessons can we draw from the Soviet-American Cold War for the Sino-American relationship? And I don't have any definitive things to say on this. I think it's too early to conclude, but I have suggestions on this. So my talk today is going to be about suggestions, and I will let this run for maybe 15 or 20 minutes, make some points, and then hope that you will have some comments on it, because I'm chiefly interested in having a discussion with Sebastian and with the rest of you along the way. So obviously, anyone talking about the current Sino-American relationship has got to acknowledge Professor Graham Allison at Harvard and his book, The Thucydides Trap, the pattern that he has drawn from history, which has come to the attention of top-level leadership on both sides, that when a rising power confronts an established power, the fear of the rising power 3 times out of 4 in all of history has generated major war. And so with China, the rising power now, what are the prospects for this? Are we destined for war, to use one of the titles of Graham's book? I think that this fear of rising powers, confronting established powers, is useful as an explanation of what happened in leading up to the 2 world wars, the rising power in both cases, of course, being Germany. And 1914 is a classic case of the fear of a rising power leading to war. But it seems to me the Cold War is a different proposition. It's came out differently. Obviously, there was no major war. And I think that perhaps that experience may be closer to our relationship with China than the pre-World War I and II relationships. So this requires talking briefly about the strategy of containment associated with George Kennan primarily, but not exclusively. And there are several major parameters to the idea of containment as Kennan articulated it as early as 1947. First of all, I think it was in line with a long-standing resistance to continental authoritarianism and a concern with maritime offshore balancing strategies. That actually goes all the way back to Elizabeth I and Philip II. So this is no new pattern. The fear is simply that anyone who dominates a huge continent not only can accumulate great power from doing so, but potentially can build naval power as well, naval power growing out of the resources of a continent, and hence can be a challenge to a maritime power over a period of time, if not contained, if not balanced against. All of this was summarized very well by Sir Halford Mackinder in his famous lecture to the Royal Geographical Society in 1904 with his Heartland Rimland thesis. And it made its way into a famous British policy document, Ire Crow's Memorandum of 1907 for King Edward, warning about the German danger in these terms and drawing the distinction between maritime power, which Crow said was inherently liberal, depends on persuasion, depends on trade, depends on acknowledging the independence of others, and continental power, which is by its nature authoritarian. You can only become a continental power by frightening, terrifying your neighbors and building up power in that sense. And I think that argument, this fear of continental authoritarianism, was something that animated the United States and its allies after World War II. The fear of the powerful position that the Soviet Union had coming out of the war, and not least, also the fear of Marxism, Leninism as a potent ideology that could have a worldwide influence. And containment was meant to be a kind of offshore balancing, to use the modern term in that regard. the purpose of it, I think, was to find a middle ground between war as had happened in 1939 and in 1914 on the one hand, and appeasement as had happened in the late 1930s, also not a good solution. And the idea was to hold the line. The idea was to maintain the balance. It's interesting to think, though, that the strategy of containment, theoretically at least, was not necessarily directed against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was our ally in balancing German and Japanese power during World War II. So that shifted very quickly, but it's this offshore balancing, I think, was not something that was aimed at a particular country, but a particular condition, the condition of some great power dominating a great continent. I think another characteristic of this was that as a consequence of this, it did not necessarily mean that the wielding of power had to, that the balancing had to produce homogeneous results. It was not a policy of democratization. It was not a policy of transferring or trying to transform the world into states similar to yourself. It was one of being content with different systems of domestic governance, but at the same time being concerned with the overall balance of the international system. It was only later that the democratization impulse, originally rooted in Woodrow Wilson, was revived, I think, by the Americans. It was also a strategy of what I call asymmetrical containment. That is, applying strengths against weaknesses. So it was a strategy which did not depend on trying to confront the Soviet Union with the same kind of power that it chiefly had, which was the power of land armies, but to apply against it, not just naval power in a military sense, but to apply against it economic power, an area in which the Soviet Union did not have the ability to compete. And that led to the Marshall Plan, of course, and some of the other features of containment as manifested in Europe during those periods. It's interesting to remember that NATO was not part of that scheme in the first place. NATO was a European idea. It was a European invitation to the Americans, having begun the process of economic revival. They said, you have to give us a military umbrella as well. And with some reluctance, this is what the Americans did. So this model of containment was one that was partly designed by allies, not always by the superpowers as well. Now, containment as practiced during the Cold War, I think, had an important dimension in that it saw the passage of time as an ally. It believed that in time, the internal contradictions of communism would cause a crisis for that government, the gap between what the system promised and what it could deliver. And it's as if Kennan turned Marx on his head. Marx had said that the internal contradictions of capitalism would bring about revolutionary conditions. But Kennan applied that to the Soviet Union. And so the idea was to hold the line and wait for time to do its work. And of course, that in the end is what wound up happening. One of the reasons that Kennan saw time as not favoring the Soviet Union was that the Soviet Union did not have a means of replacing its leaders when they became incompetent, when they became decrepit, when they became senile. There was no way to replace them short of overthrowing them or waiting for them to die. And that in itself was a major weakness for the Soviet system, which turned out, as time went on, to suffer more and more from the incompetence of senescent leaders with no plans, no means of replacing them. So it certainly is true that containment during the Cold War did not clearly and in all instances follow its own logic. It got very nervous when issues or when parts of the world that it had deemed not vital to the offshore balance nonetheless came under attack, as happened in Korea in 1950 or as happened in Vietnam later on. It became very edgy about its own credibility, the credibility of American power in the world, thereby raising questions of who determines what credibility is in the first place. Is it something you do yourself, or is it something that you look to others to do? And I think if you look to others to do it, you're losing control of a situation. And as the Americans became more and more concerned about falling dominoes, that really was a matter of yielding the initiative to others who could spook the Americans by saying, if you don't do what we want you to do, we will fall, we will topple, and your credibility will be shot. The Russians ran into something like that problem, tails wagging dogs as well. So that was a problem with the containment strategy. Certainly, containment relied more heavily than was necessary on a military buildup. There was no excuse for the level of the number of nuclear weapons that were accumulated by both the United States and the Soviet Union during this period. Nobody knew what to do with these weapons, but nobody knew how to turn off the production of them in the face of the possibility that the other side might get them. So there were problems with containment, but in the end, after 40, 45 years, containment came out much as Kennan had foreseen, although it took much longer than he expected, and it finally happened under the leadership of a president of whom Kennan was profoundly suspicious, Ronald Reagan. This was a great shock to Kennan in old age that Ronald Reagan was the final and most successful architect of containment. It's also interesting to note that thanks to an unexpected cooperation between President Nixon, Dr. Kissinger, and Mao Zedong, China itself became an instrument in the containment of the Soviet Union, and the turn in American-China policy in 1971 and 1972 actually enlisted one communist state in balancing another communist state, and in fact, driving a wedge between them. And I think that showed really more clearly than almost any other historical episode in the Cold War, the extent to which maintaining a global balance was the chief concern without respect to differing domestic systems, historical grievances, ideological disparities, and whatnot. It was a cold-blooded, some would say cynical, but certainly effective strategy of balancing, from which the Soviet Union never completely recovered in the end. So what then is the relevance of all of this today? What is the issue with China today? Is Chinese resentment of the United States, Chinese criticism of the United States, based in the perception that the United States is trying to contain in some way China? And the question that would then come up, don't all great powers try to contain other great powers? Isn't this quite a natural phenomenon of the international system? And if containment was really had the objective of maintaining a balance of power in the world, would the Chinese today really object to that? Do the Chinese seek to dominate the world, or is their goal to maintain a balance of power in the world? And I think that these are interesting questions to consider. I suspect it's the latter. I see very little evidence that the Chinese have global domination in mind. They certainly have a lot of other things in mind, but not, I think, that. So much of this, I think, will revolve around the extent to which we can identify with the Chinese common interests in the balance of power. It might be interesting just to summarize briefly similarities and differences between the current situation and what happened in the Cold War. Certainly, the current situation sounds like one that would have been familiar to Halford Mackinder. So there is the concern about continental consolidation. There is the concern, which Mackinder certainly had, with railroads as an instrument of continental consolidation. The Belt and Road Project today it is as alarming to some people as the completion of the Trans-Siberian Railroad was to Mackinder back in 1904 and in 1905. And the concern is with what kind of power the Chinese could accumulate if they wind up in control of large portions of Eurasia. What does that imply for the Chinese Navy and Air Force, who traditionally have been much weaker than those forces of the United States? So this is one where the historical echoes are still pretty prominent. The nuclear weapons, of course, still exist and still function as a deterrent to escalation. It's very interesting that China has so many fewer nuclear weapons than both Russia and the United States do, but deterrence works just as well with 400 as it would with 4,000. The Cold War showed that for sure. Continental power does still seem to require, at least as the Chinese are defining it, homogenization, that is incorporating satellites and transforming satellites and changing the minds of people, remolding minds of people in satellite states in a way that maritime power doesn't seem to. We seem to be able to function. For example, with the Japanese, without any sense that it's obligatory on us or on them to try to remold each other's minds. But look at the Chinese with the Uyghurs, and you see a pretty good example of what I mean. And I think it's fair to say that the resentments imposed by this process of homogenization are deeply rooted and are unlikely to go away. So remember that the Soviet Union was trying to create homogeneous territories with the non-Russian republics around its borders. And yet the independent mindedness of the Balkans or of the Georgians or of the Kazakhs or whatever never entirely went away and resurfaced very quickly in the 1990s, bringing about the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'm not convinced that this won't happen again with China, for sure. China is also, I think, increasingly getting into the position that the Soviet Union was in of having satellites, but no friends. As you accumulate satellites, you tend to lose friends because the process of accumulating satellites is often a brutal process in one way or another. Again, the Uyghur example showing that. And all of this parallels something that Gibbon said in The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, one of Kennan's favorite quotations, that nothing is more difficult than holding in thraldom conquered provinces. They are always, in the long run, a sense of weakness. And it seems to me that as the Chinese try to consolidate their rule, not only with the Uyghurs, but also with Hong Kong and what they might do with Taiwan, this rule may well apply. I don't think the resentments generated in that process would go away very easily. One big difference, it seems to me, at least on the surface, between the Soviet Union and China is the handling of the economy. And obviously the Chinese are far more competent in handling their economy than the old Soviet Union ever was. And this is a powerful model for the rest of the world. It's in many ways more attractive to the rest of the world than anything that the Americans can point to in terms of economic management in recent years. But the situation is not without its parallels, because just remember how discredited democracy and capitalism were in the 1930s, and how much credibility the Soviet Union, as well as Nazi Germany, had. Authoritarian methods that had, or so it seemed, revived the economies of those countries and dealt with the problem of unemployment. So these parallels still, in kind of a way, exist. So I think that there are some similarities between the situations. I also see some differences, and it's with this that I'll wind up. One of them is technology, which never completely reverses itself. And so the impressive feature of modern technology, obviously, is the internet and the capabilities that it provides, particularly for surveillance, which go well beyond what was available to the authoritarians of the 1930s or the 1940s or the 1950s. It's not clear that this will eliminate resistance or resentment. I think probably not, but it may make it much easier to deal with it or to head it off early on. It's also interesting as a difference that there are no serious ideological issues between China and the West in the way that there were in the Cold War. All of us are capitalists now in one form or another. The varieties of capitalism vary, of course, but that is not an issue now. So the contradictions are among capitalists, all of which in a backhanded, funny sort of way vindicates Marx, who said that in the end, this would be what brought the capitalist system to a halt, would be the contradictions existing within it that seemed ill-considered during the Cold War, but it may be more well-considered in the current situation. There's also a difference, I think, in the extent to which Chinese society and American society know each other. Chiefly because of the greater number of exchanges, students and others, that took place when the relationship was warmer, but they are still taking place today. And there was never anything like that with regard to the Soviet Union in the Cold War. The Soviet Union remained very much an opaque place, but China really opened up and became transparent after the events of the 1970s. One other dissimilarity, it seems to me, is that the Chinese have the luxury of being able to build a military which is not dependent on institutional continuities. They can build it afresh. They can build a navy from scratch. And the Americans, in maintaining their military forces, still do so, limited by the structures that they accumulated. You cannot, having built 14 aircraft carriers, you cannot simply say, we don't need those anymore. And what do we do with them? Do we sink them? The American Marines, interestingly, have said just recently, we don't need tanks anymore. And so we're going to dump our tanks into the ocean, but that's very rare for sure. And it's really a burden for the military to try to deal with the weight of history in this regard. But finally, and here is where I want to end up, is with the events of this week in the United States. The Americans have once again shown, unless I am badly wrong here, that constitutional safeguards against authoritarianism still are alive and well and healthy in the United States. Trump's term limit has just been set, and the term is going to expire in January, or so it seems. And I think this is a major achievement. It could easily have gone the other way. And it could have sent a profoundly demoralizing signal to the rest of the world that if the American constitutional safeguards against authoritarianism are that weak, then how strong can constitutional safeguards elsewhere be in this regard? So this is a very important week, it seems to me. I think we may be moving with this week from what I would regard as a slide toward authoritarianism on a worldwide scale over the last 10, or 15 years to something else. I think we may have just lived through a turning point. But of course, you never know whether you have lived through a turning point or not until long after the point has turned. So I have to hedge everything with the historian's traditional warning about these kinds of things, we'll have to wait and see. Sebastian, that's it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, John, for that and for ending on that very apt consideration of what the American election represents. I'd like briefly just to turn to China and revisit what you were talking about, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and something that comes up in international relations about this idea of the ruling bargain, that authoritarian states can justify the suspension of civil liberties or the curtailment of freedom of expression, freedom of speech, by providing something else in the form of employment, economic growth, increase in living standards. And it seems that China has successfully held on to that ruling bargain, that they're able to, for now at least, or superficially, but it seems that they have. What do you see, or would you imagine would be potential challenges to the ruling bargain over the coming years? What could threaten the integrity of the Chinese state in a way that when the Soviet Union disintegrated in the way it did? Or is China that much stronger a state than the Soviet Union?
Well, I think there are a lot of things. Because China is now capitalist, it is subject to the vagaries of capitalist economies. So a stock market crash could happen. There are any number of other things similar that could happen. There's no way to see these coming, and it's possible that they would manage these as competently as they have other things in the past. But on the other hand, it also seems to me that as they move toward more and more toward an authoritarian economy, toward an authoritarian politics, authoritarian leadership, the regime in Beijing blinds itself to what is happening in the rest of the country and with regard to the rest of the economy. So one of the problems with authoritarian rule is that the authoritarian leader actually knows less about what's happening on the ground in the country than the more open democratic leader, because people fear to be honest with their bosses under those systems. So I think that's a huge weakness that could certainly propel itself over the years. The other problem is simply this: if Xi Jinping proposes to remain ruler for life, then how long is his life? And how healthy will he be when he gets really old, and so on? And to what extent will he be able to keep all these balls in the air and manage this? And what about rivals jockeying for the succession? How long can he hold those off? That's something that an authoritarian leader has got to do. He's got to keep all the potential successors off balance, containing each other, and that becomes difficult to do. So I think there's some vulnerabilities there, which would certainly exist on the side of the Western capitalist states as well, but may be magnified under the Chinese system now that it has abolished term limits.
Yes, it seems, as you were saying, that Xi Jinping is trying to, he's sort of molding himself in very much a kind of Mao style of trying to cultivate a legacy. I would like briefly to turn to the idea
of... By the way, not the best model if you're...
No, exactly, yeah.
Mao is not who you would look to.
But
certainly, question.
No, certainly, as you say, but to try and create an imprint or a lasting impression, to provide an ideological kind of undertone to Chinese government. But briefly, just to turn to proxies and the idea of proxy conflict, certainly within the Cold War. Obviously, you mentioned Korea and Vietnam, and certainly in Southern Africa and Latin America as well. And it seems the beginning of something that's not been mentioned as much recently, but was a few years ago, was the South China Sea as an area of potential proxy conflict. Do you see the South China Sea as a locus of proxy conflict in future years? Do you see it as something that is we're not talking about enough, and do you think that's something that could play out between America and China?
I think it's absolutely a dangerous situation. And to the extent that we have a situation that parallels the situation of Berlin in the Cold War, I think maybe Taiwan is that situation because it's, nobody disputes that Taiwan is part of China, but what does that mean about that? There is all kinds of dispute, and just as there was between the two Germanys, and particularly about the status of Berlin. And so in the end, in the Cold War, the great powers tiptoed around the Berlin issue and but not without great risk, as we know. And paradoxically, in the end, the building of the wall solved the Berlin issue, but not necessarily to the advantage of the Berliners. So I don't mean to say that situations are equivalent, but I do mean to say that with Taiwan, we have an increasingly independent-minded group of people who seem, by democratic means, to favor their own autonomy from China, but who nonetheless are Chinese without question. And they aren't as accessible to mainland China as Hong Kong is or has been. So I see that as a very sensitive area. I think one of the big questions right now is for the American military and for the American government, is it necessary really for us to maintain an aggressive naval presence right off the coast of China in the first place? What is our interest in maintaining freedom of navigation in the South China Sea? Do we have the capability to do it now with the developments that are taking place in Chinese weaponry and with the vulnerability of our own ships? You know, can we do it in the first place? What's the balance between what you can do and what you should proclaim it to be your interest in doing in these things? And again, part of the blob thinking that tends to develop, part of the conventional wisdom that tends to develop, is that you can never really give up commitments previously made. But some of these commitments previously made to patrol the coastline off the shore of China, some of those commitments go back 60 or 70 years. So to what extent can they be reconsidered in the light of the new realities? I think that's going to be a huge question for sure.
And just to pick up on what you had mentioned, particularly on the Berlin question and in the origins of the Cold War, particularly the kind of beyond the ideological construct between Marxist-Leninism and obviously capitalism on the other side, that became the Cold War. But even before then, the question of Germany, what to do with Germany. You know, this has been a country that had caused unbelievable harm in the first part of the 20th century, and this idea of kind of the Sonderweg, the special journey of Germany, had kind of come to this horrific conclusion. Do you think that actually beyond ideology, it was the failure of the four, you can call them four powers, to agree on a settlement of the German question that made the Cold War not inevitable, but certainly brought it to a possibility, or a strong possibility?
Well, I think it was one of several things, Sebastian. And so the very fact that the Soviets and the Americans each wound up with half of Europe, or half of Europe under their control, and the Europeans wound up being so much weaker, almost ensured some kind of a clash between these external non-European superpowers over one thing or another. And of course, Germany, as the central, pretty much the center of European geopolitics, was very logical in those terms as the place. But you know, even if there had been an agreement on Germany, improbable as that seems, I think there still would have been plenty of Cold War rivalries. I'm one of those who would simply be inclined to say that the Cold War, if not inevitable, was close to it. And I would say that that really is a matter of what it would have taken for the Russians, for Stalin, to be reassured, to feel comfortable, having no normal ocean boundaries, easily defendable boundaries, having been open to invasion from so many different sources over so many different years, and still being a firm believer in an ideology that saw the rest of the world as hostile, as we know Stalin was now. So I think as long as he was there, it was in the cards that there was going to be some kind of Cold War. Remember that Stalin, to the end of his days, believed that there would be another world war. It's just that he believed it would be between America and Great Britain. As Comrade Marx had said, it must be capitalists fighting each other. But nonetheless, this was not someone who looked forward to a peaceful world.
No, that's very much interesting to see, actually, that, as you say, if not over Germany, there would have been a kind of the two visions of society at loggerheads if it hadn't, Germany was the immediate, but actually you
Right.
positioning it as an inevitability. But actually, I mean, I would like to bring more broadly in terms of, as you were mentioning, in terms of the One Belt, One Road, and maybe drawing up some parallels between other, not necessarily political or ideological unity, but economic unity in the Cold War through, the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, and also bringing states or bodies under the kind of Chinese sphere of influence through One Belt, One Road. Do you see those parallels there, and do you see, actually, as you say, the kind of, when as soon as that turned sour through questions of debt as well, then actually even with economic cooperation, ideology plays a much more important role than economics in these questions?
Well, I think it's important to think about One Belt, One Road, perhaps in comparison to the Marshall Plan, because both promised economic benefits to the recipient nations, for sure. But geographically, they were very different because we are 3,000 miles away by ocean providing this assistance. China is next door, a land power providing this assistance. And no doubt that the promise of cash coming in, ports being developed, railroads being built, all of this is alluring to many of the nations and states of Central Asia. But I don't think it's going to be without resentment. I think there is already resentment over China drawing these countries into debt traps where they can't repay their debts. I think as time goes on, there will be resentment on the part of other great powers in the region, which was not something that really was an issue in the Cold War. But what is India going to think about One Belt, One Road? And even more important, what is Russia going to think about One Belt, One Road in the long run? Nobody talks about that. But I think it's a major consideration that the Russians may feel that to be a major challenge to them. And then just to complicate the process as well, the roads, paradoxically, as the Chinese define them, are the maritime routes. And so there's the route through the Indian Ocean, which is there. But there's also potentially the route across or through the Arctic with global warming. So think about the geopolitics of this. If, in fact, the Chinese continue to begin to develop a dependence on the northern route, trade route to Europe, and begin to build the support structures and bases and whatnot that are necessary to sustain that. What is the implication going to be for Russia's response to this? So I see various reasons why the Russian-Chinese relationship, currently a reasonably close one, would not once again fall into its much more familiar pattern, which is one of mutual suspicion over the years. I think this just comes in this sense with what the Chinese are trying to do. And somehow the Marshall Plan to the European recipients of it, the Marshall Plan seemed safer, and maybe it was because America was much further away. But I think it was also because the Europeans had a very clear sense of there being something worse out there, which was the Russians, of course. And that made American support for them much more palatable. It's interesting to raise the question of what the something worse might be for a country like India or Pakistan or Russia, in this case. And that's a good question as well. Not much talked about, it seems to me.
Well, I mean, and in terms of, looking at what states look to as these kind of big regional players or global players, and sort of looking for some degree of global leadership. And I think if I turn to go back to the origins of the Cold War and this idea, I think that one of the thesis of the US is kind of an empire by invitation.
Yep.
And the idea that actually American supremacy post-war was essential to the setup as it played out. I mean, one of the questions that came up actually at Cambridge in a recent debate at the Union was this idea of, is American supremacy dead? Is American supremacy nigh? Do you think it is? And if it is there anything that can be done to change it?
I'm sorry, was American supremacy what?
Sort of dead at the end.
Dead. No, I don't. Well, I kind of hope so. I think supremacy is a bad situation to be aiming for. I would like to see substantial American influence in the world. But supremacy, I don't like that term. We have used it periodically in our planning documents. I think it's arrogant, and any nation that seeks supremacy, any nation that proclaims itself to be the indispensable nation, as the Americans have a habit of doing, I think is asking for trouble in this regard. I think we should simply say we wish to be helpful, or something like that, something a little more innocuous, you know. And I don't think that necessarily requires supremacy. I don't think we ever had supremacy in the first place. I don't think supremacy is achievable for us or for the Chinese or anybody else. The globe is a big place. Power is fragmented. Power is diverse. And resistance can be generated at a lot of different levels in the long run. So I'm not too worried about that. I would just like to see more humility in American foreign policy than we saw in the Clinton and in the Bush administrations. And then I would like to see much more competence than we have seen in the Obama and particularly in the Trump administration. So those are a more modest wish list more modest items on my wish list.
Yes, it was interesting because actually I think back towards, I think one of the recent books that came out on Truman, and the idea of the accidental president, and also towards the end of the Second World War, that possibly, you know, that moment where Japan had been defeated saw America at its best, and it was never repeated. No American president saw America at a kind of a greater global dominance. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do agree with that, and I think the effort to reintegrate Japan, but also the effort to reintegrate Germany into the Western system was very, very far-reaching and very wise, and was similar to what the great powers did in 1815 in trying to reintegrate France after Napoleon, and what the great powers did not do after World War I with both Russia and Germany. And I think a vast mistake was made early on in the post-Cold War period by the muddled American policy of expanding NATO. It's entirely possible that the expansion of NATO was a good thing to do and a responsible thing to do. But that was not why the decision was made. The decision was made extremely casually in the Clinton administration, which was simultaneously trying to maintain a very close relationship with the Russians. And there seemed to be no awareness that expanding NATO into the former territory of the Soviet Union, while at the same time maintaining a warm and friendly relationship with the leaders of Russia, there was no sense that that was a contradiction there. And it seems to me that this has led to all kinds of trouble, not least the difficulty of deciding where to stop. The Americans were never able to decide where to stop the expansion of NATO. In the end, Putin decided that for them by attacking Georgia in 2008 and ending any talk about bringing Georgia into NATO. So when you let the other side draw the limits of your own ambition and capability, I think you're in trouble. And it just means that you have stopped thinking about hard strategic issues, which always are a matter of separating out vital and peripheral interests, always a matter of balancing inconvenient contradictions without being able to resolve the contradictions.
It was interesting.
Sorry, that sounded kind of like
no,
like a sermon or something.
Not at all. I mean, one of the things that's come up recently as a result of Trump's election and his time has been this idea of globalism, or this kind of globalism being a bugbear. And certainly this is something that you've seen as a central tenet of kind of a struggle within America about whether to play an assertive role in global affairs, or whether not to. That's something that's kind of been in 20th century American history. That's been a central tenet. I mean, is your indication or your understanding that actually the American public does want to see a kind of America take a place in global affairs, or does it wish to see America return to a more isolationist position, one that might be envisaged by a Joe Kennedy or that sort of idea?
I don't think anybody is holding out Joe Kennedy as a model these days, for sure. But I do think that the public is impatient with our continued global role, which we seem to be playing without being able to explain what we're doing or why we're doing it. So particularly with the long and unending wars in the Middle East that we seem to get involved in. And patience with those has pretty well been exhausted now. Even Obama was seeing that. I was trying to monitor this because I would have every time we had somebody here to talk about Syria, I would just raise the question, well, exactly what are we trying to do in Syria? And none of the experts, none of the Syrian experts, whether at Yale or in Washington or whatnot, who came through, could ever tell me what it was exactly that we were trying to do in Syria in the first place. And I think something like that perplexity existed with Iraq and with Afghanistan as well. So I think you're in trouble when you cannot explain to yourself what it is that you're doing. You're doing it somehow because of a kind of creeping incrementalism. You got in, but you did so without knowing how to get out. And the public simply has gotten impatient with that, particularly as the domestic infrastructure has deteriorated. We have a serious crisis, as you may have noticed, with healthcare. We have a serious crisis with collapsing bridges and highways and whatnot. We have a serious race problem, which is nothing new in American history, but the inequality issue is certainly there. And that is not just a race problem, it goes beyond race. So these are all significant issues. And I think the public does feel that these things deserve more attention than they've been getting over the years. It certainly doesn't mean isolationism, but it does mean a recognition that you can be no stronger in world affairs than you are in domestic affairs, and this is where attention needs to be paid. Maybe Trump has been good for us in that sense.
Exactly. Well, I think it was. I mean, one of a lot of Chinese media outlets were sending out news story, America in chaos. Look at American as an example of Trump refusing to concede or refusing to accept. And so it seems to me like get your own house in order might be a good thing to go on. I'm conscious that we've got questions from others. I'll close with one final question of my own before opening up. Your relationship with George Kennan. I'm keen to explore that a little bit further. What did he get right, and what did he get wrong? And if what he got wrong, did he regret about getting wrong?
Well, I think he got right basically the strategy of containment itself, which came out very much as he said it would. He said, we do not have to defeat the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union will, over time, defeat itself from its own internal contradictions. And that was really quite on target. He was off on the timing. He expected that this would take 15 years. It actually took about 45 years for this to happen. And in the process, he became extremely disillusioned and bitter about some of what he regarded as the departures from the strategy of containment, the big military buildup, the reliance on nuclear weapons, the involvement in third world conflicts. He was a strong opponent, early opponent of the war in Vietnam, for example. The neglect of environmental issues as well. And toward the end of his life, when the events of the early 1980s were vindicating him, I would talk to him. We talked frequently about this. And I would say, look, George, your ideas are now being vindicated. And he would not have it. He would not agree to this at all because it was all happening under Ronald Reagan. And somehow he could not get his mind around the idea that Reagan might be some kind of geopolitical wizard or genius. That's now become fairly conventional wisdom, but it certainly was not for George. But but he had high standards. He was never really satisfied. He was a critic of himself. He was always a critic of his country. And it's very difficult to know what would have pleased him because of this. So he was somebody who simply went through life feeling that things were not living up to his own standards, and that he himself was not living up to his own standards.
Brilliant.
He was, he was not a happy camper, Sebastian.
No. Well, sounds it, definitely. But we were discussing actually the value of when writing biography to be able to ring up your subject matter and ask these questions. And
well, for me, it was a perfect project because I made the agreement with him that I would become the biographer when he was 78 years old. And the agreement was always that it would be a posthumous biography. And because he knew as a historian himself that biographies can't be any good if the biographer is always worrying about what the subject of the biography is going to say. But neither one of us thought that it would be so long that he would live until he was 101, dying in 2005. So it's very interesting, as I was mentioning to you, it was very interesting late in life to get these phone calls from George Kennan apologizing for not dying and for thereby delaying the book. And it was also interesting. I figured out that my own students were taking bets on which one of us would go first. So it was, as it turned out, it was fine. It was a very good arrangement, and I'm very grateful to have had the chance to do that. But it had its peculiar moments, shall we say, along the way.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, John, and for answering my question. I'm going to open it up now to some of we've got two people with their hands up in the chat function. I'm going to unmute George first. So you should be, if you can ask your question, that would be great.
I was wondering what you think of the idea of America potentially trying to build India up as a potential democratic superpower to counter the growing influence of China, perhaps as America's own power wanes. I know it's maybe complicated a little bit by recent events in India, political events. But I was wondering what you thought of that.
Well, of course, India is a democratic power and has been a democratic power since its founding. That's one of the remarkable things about it. It's chaotic, it's messy. So is ours. Our democracy, too, has these features, for sure. But one of the things that had been a problem during the Cold War was that there was never a warm relationship between the Americans and the Indians, chiefly because of the issue of Pakistan. And because of Indian neutrality or non-alignment under Nehru. That's all changing now. It's a different configuration of power, and I don't doubt that the Indians, Modi, are worried about Chinese ambitions. We know about the clashes that are taking place up in the Himalayas along that contested border. And so it seems to me reasonable, without the Americans having to do very much in the situation, that India is going to align itself with America as a way of balancing China. And it seems like it's a perfectly natural thing to do. And I would just hope that we would be open to it, as I think we are. I think we have been open to it really since the George W. Bush administration. And agreements were made about the treatment of how to regard the Indian nuclear capability and so on and so forth. So I think that's a perfectly natural relationship. What I'm interested in is, as I said, the one that doesn't get talked about, which is the possibility of a Russian-American reconciliation at some point out of Russian fear or concern about the Chinese. And I think that one is something that sooner or later will happen. And it'll be interesting to watch it when it does. It could happen over clashing ambitions in Central Asia. It could happen over clashing aspirations in the Arctic. But just because these are both authoritarian powers doesn't mean they are doesn't mean they aren't going to have clashes of interest. The geography alone dictates that. there are very few people these days who take geography seriously, but in fact, it should be taken seriously. It doesn't change. Or if it changes at a glacial pace, maybe the pace of continental drift or something like that. So I don't think we have to worry about that. So yeah, I'm looking for that to happen at some point. And that's what I mean about sooner or later, China will make its own enemies. We don't necessarily have to recruit allies, but China will make its own enemies through its economic clout, economic imperialism is always a mixed bag. It has benefits, but it generates resentments as well. But there's one other thing I didn't mention in my talk, but I think it's significant. Chinese cultural insensitivity toward other cultures. China is a very self-centered culture and has very little experience dealing with other cultures. And when they go into the third world, when they go into unfamiliar terrain, they can come across as being just as brash and ignorant and insensitive as the Americans used to do in the third world, or as the Russians did when they tried to build support, for example, in Africa in the late parts of the Cold War. So I think on that score, that's a source of Chinese weakness, the very idea that there can only be one sun under the heaven. There cannot be two. That is a long-term weakness for them.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. And it's interesting just to pick up on, as you were saying, America's not in the position where it needs to recruit allies. China will do that for them in a way. I want to pick up on the relationship a little bit just with Russia, because of course it's a complicated one from Russia's perspective and probably from America's perspective with likely a new democratic leadership. A lot of bridges have been burnt over supposed interference in the election, and certainly the perception that whilst Trump was meant to represent a reconciliation with Russia, herald a new era in American-Russian relations, it never really bore fruit. Why do you think that was? Why do you think that Donald Trump in his election campaign talked about reconciling with other strong-arm leaders, whether that be Putin, whether that actually be in North Korea? Why do you think it's never materialized under a Trump administration?
Well, it's characteristic, Sebastian. Each time a new administration comes in, they claim to be resetting relations with Russia. And so when the Obama administration came in and Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, she actually went to Moscow with a little button that you could push, which was supposed to say reset, But whoever was translating it got it wrong, and it said instead something like "screw you" or whatever. So that was a bad start to begin with. But this business of wanting to start off on a fresh foot is not unusual. I think much depends, obviously, on Putin. He's not going to be there forever. There'll be a successor to him, and I think there's not much we can do. We just have to wait for this situation to manifest itself. Putin is popular. Many Russians feel that the country can only hang together with a strong man, just as many Chinese feel the same thing. But it certainly need not, it seems to me, involve a Russian-American clash. This is, however, one of the reasons why I think NATO expansion is destabilizing, because the very fact that we now have the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia in NATO, these are parts, whether justly or unjustly, of the old Soviet Union. This is a very touchy issue with the Russians. And it should be a touchy issue with us when you consider if an attack ever came, how would we defend Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia? I think that's a classic example of projecting your commitments beyond your capabilities. And I wish some line had been drawn at an earlier stage that would have said our concern should be with the political independence and the economic viability of these former Russian republics. But we cannot form military alliances with everybody. And we have to draw the line somewhere. And maybe military feasibility is a good place to draw it. And that kind of thinking just didn't happen. So that is a source of instability, just as the continuing American naval commitment in the Western Pacific, I think, is a source of instability as well. And this is one of the problems in Washington. You know, it's very hard for Washington, having made a commitment, to reconsider the commitment, or to reconfigure the commitment, or whatever term you might want to use here, for fear of losing credibility. And that's a kind of paralysis. It's a kind of intellectual paralysis, which can lead to geopolitical vulnerability, it seems to me.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. And I've got another question from the audience. Hans, I'm going to unmute you now, and you should be able to answer.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much. It was really interesting to hear all about this. My question actually touches very much exactly at this area. And it's basically, you really think that the containment strategy of the US has stopped in 1990 because looking at especially the eastern extension of the NATO, but then again looking at Putin's speeches in 2001 at the German Parliament and then 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, it seemed to be a real chance to include Russia more into the Western world, but then all these possibilities were burned at certain points. And do you think there's still that those are still some results from the former Cold War strategies in the White House in the US, or where do you see the reasons for that?
Well, I think much of it is a result of the changes in leadership in Russia. As long as Boris Yeltsin was in, Boris Yeltsin put up with a lot. You know, he put up with NATO expansion, but he depended on at least the hope of American assistance, hope of American economic assistance. Not much of it was forthcoming. He was back and forth. He loved being received in Washington at the White House, all of that kind of thing. But Boris Yeltsin, of course, grew increasingly incompetent as time went on, and never was completely off the bottle, you know, which was a considerable weakness for him. Putin is a much more disciplined and focused figure. And while Putin may well have been open to some kind of arrangement, some kind of amicable cooperation with the Americans in the early OOs, his being the first to commiserate with George W. Bush after the 9/11 attack and so on and so forth, is an example of that. But very quickly, Putin, I think, got the sense that the Americans were not going to do much for Russia, particularly the continued push toward NATO expansion. And then one other thing as well, which is that we make a big issue of Russian involvement in our internal political affairs. But we rarely acknowledge the extent to which we have tried to interfere in Russian political affairs. So some years ago, we had a major democratization campaign going on inside Russia. We were trying to promote working with the opposition. We were trying to resist Putin or find some alternative to Putin. We were very concerned about his artificial election or re-election. And even more so, we were doing this in Ukraine, and some people would say we were complicit in the overthrow of the Ukrainian government there, which was a major consideration for the Russians. And so it didn't take long for this to begin to grate on Putin, and once it did, he's very skillful at making the best of a weak situation. There's no question that his situation was not strong, but he very quickly seized the initiative with things like the seizure of Crimea, knowing that nothing would be done about that, and opening to China. You know, so I think we're beyond the point of being able to deal with Putin at this point, just as I think we're beyond the point of being able to deal with Xi at this point. I think changes in both countries are going to depend on new leadership because the suspicions of the old leadership, the existing leadership, are so great, whether justly or not, that we'll just have to wait on that, it seems to me.
Brilliant. Can I check before we bring the session to a close if there's not any more questions from the audience? If you do, make sure you raise your hand on the Zoom function. Oh, we've got another question. It's hands. Is that another? That's absolutely fine because we're brilliant. If you want to ask another question, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. This one is more about the Sino-American relations. How far do you think would the US and as well as China go in order to secure partners at this stage? Is there the real possibility, like during the Cold War, of overthrowing governments in order to secure, or overthrowing incumbents, or in order to secure your own situation in a certain country that is deemed important, or only because of the impact it might have on other countries?
I'm not sure that we are as much involved in that business as we once were. I could be totally wrong on this, but it's not quite clear to me who we would wish to overthrow at this point. It does seem to me that the Chinese do a pretty good job of alienating their neighbors as things stand. Consider the status of the US-Vietnam relationship, of all things. You know, that somehow our strongest ally in Southeast Asia is now Vietnam, communist Vietnam. And that is China's doing. And something like that is happening around as well. We're certainly not going to overthrow the government of Japan. There's no need to, or South Korea, no need to. The Korean peninsula, as always, is yet another source of instability left over from the Cold War. And who knows what can happen there. It's always unpredictable. But it doesn't seem to me that that same mentality exists now as it did in the Cold War. Then one other thing, just as a point of reference, Russian interference in American politics. I've seen no evidence really of any substantial Russian interference in this current election. The people have certainly been looking out for it. People have been on the alert for it, but nobody seems to have come up with even halfway plausible evidence that the Russians have been active this time around. I don't know what that means. I don't know whether they're embarrassed to have been exposed. I don't know whether it's because maybe they're learning to love us, but I think that's unlikely. It may be because certain other initiatives on their part have embarrassingly failed. The survival of Mr. Navalny from his poisoning has got to be an embarrassing situation now. They certainly have alienated Germany as a result of that event, as well as other countries. So I'm not quite sure how to explain this, but I do see a very different pattern from the 2016 election in that regard. And I think we're all breathing a kind of sigh of relief that that was not a greater issue this time around, as far as we know.
Brilliant. And we have a question from Jason.
Hi there. Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. I wanted to ask, when it comes to comparing the political climate after World War II and that of today, it would appear to me that there are a multitude of distinct existential threats that may not necessarily have been there between 1945 and 1950. And this isn't to homogenize or simplify US policy and foreign policy priorities at that time. But today you can point to climate change, political and religious extremism. Well, we're in the midst of a global pandemic. And it would appear that the relative priority given to these issues is immensely volatile and is very dependent on the direction of US elections. Does China benefit from this, given that what we will see if Biden does become president will be a distinct set of policy priorities quite different from Trump's? And I guess going off that, what would a Biden presidency potentially look like for relations between China and America?
I don't know. Part of the problem, and here I'm sympathetic to the Chinese, is that they have great difficulty figuring out what American priorities on China are. Part of the puzzlement over the years has been how to interpret American foreign policy in the first place, because it seems to go in several different directions at once. One of the few people who keeps in touch with the Chinese regularly is Dr. Kissinger, and I've heard him talk about this, how puzzled they are about what the Americans really want. And I think the answer is, we don't always know what we want. Different parts of us want different things, for sure. So I think that's an issue. I do think climate change is intriguing, as is the pandemic, the health crisis. There was an interesting Ronald Reagan episode when Ronald Reagan first met Gorbachev in Geneva in 1985. And he surprised everybody, including Gorbachev, by talking about Martians. And he said, if Martians should land tomorrow, Mikhail, you and I would find that our differences had resolved very quickly. And he said, why aren't nuclear weapons the functional equivalent of Martians? They endanger us both on equal terms, you see. Well, I think that was a profound insight about the Cold War, and certainly true, but I think there are a couple of other things, as you mentioned, that now fall into this category of being Martians or the equivalent. And one is global warming, obviously, and the other is the pandemic, which has really opened our eyes to a completely new danger, existential danger, that we did not see coming. And that's affecting everybody equally. So if it has this effect that it did with Reagan and Gorbachev with nuclear weapons, where they suddenly discover a common interest in something, then it seems to me that can change the nature of the ballgame. And certainly in the Cold War, as gradually the Soviets and the Americans realized that they faced certain common threats, progress began to be made. One of the most interesting but little written, little explored episodes is how both sides came to tolerate reconnaissance satellites in the Cold War. Reconnaissance satellites are spy planes, or spy satellites, really. And the Russians got very upset when we sent the U-2 spy plane over and ultimately found a way to shoot it down. But why didn't they shoot down our reconnaissance satellites that started going over just at about that time, And why didn't we try to shoot down their satellites and so on? And why has nobody else really tried to shoot down somebody else's satellite? There's some experiments that have been done, particularly by the Chinese. But does anybody really have an interest in blinding these devices that are up there? And so far, it seems no, that this is an equal benefit provided to all, just as somehow warding off global warming would be an equal benefit provided to all, and somehow just as caution regarding nuclear weapons would be an equal benefit provided to all. So one of the things we have to think about, I think, is how we can think much more clearly about equal benefits provided to all, and what those might be, and what others might be that we haven't even thought of yet. And it seems to me that this is really where the fundamental emphasis should go, because this doesn't depend on ideological differences. It doesn't really depend on cultural differences. It simply is an acknowledgement, again, of geographical and ecological realities. And there's no argument about that. Quite often it'll take a catastrophe of some sort to raise our consciousness on these things. Just in the pandemic is one of those, for sure. And periodically hurricanes and rising ocean levels will do the same on the global warming issue. But these things can also be catalysts for change, as they were in the Cold War, and with mutually beneficial results, it seems to me. So I'm not a bleak pessimist on all of this. Really.
No, as you say, it's interesting that you can find those common common enemies, common threats. You can't attach them to a state. Global warming can't be attached to a state. You have the politics of global warming, in the sense that China will argue that America and Britain have benefited from years of unchecked pollution to benefit their economy, but obviously now they happen to be industrializing. But it seems to me, and it seems to, that actually China is beginning to come round to the idea of cooperating on and dropping
I think
the
so,
argument.
and I think one of the things that made it very clear in a completely unexpected way was when the big lockdowns took place in China, how the skies cleared on those days in those cities. And something like that happened in India very noticeably as well, and to some extent in this country. And suddenly, if a pandemic forces everybody inside and ends commuting and travel and so on and so forth, and suddenly you look up and the sky is clear, you can see the sky, and this has a powerful impact. So I'm sure the pandemic is going to be changing our procedures quite dramatically. I think elderly professors like myself will henceforth not travel outside of their own studies, which you can see behind me, and will just rely on Zoom conversations to deal with their students, and so you can deal with them anywhere in the world, which is great. And I think we're going to see reduced commuting. We're going to see much more working from home in this country, and I suspect probably others as well, with profound effects on the economy, whether for good or ill remains to be seen. But these things shake things up, and we are witnessing that for sure right now.
I think we have a final question. I want to check it there, George. George, do you have another question? Your hand is up, just if you... No? Okay. Oh. No, okay, no, sorry, that was for a hand kept up from previous. Well, brilliant. I think if we have no further questions from the audience, obviously, please do raise your hand if you do. Then I think, brilliant. Well, thank you very much to John for coming on and giving up an hour and 15 of your time. It's, as we said before, it's a remarkable thing that we can do this now from anywhere in the world, and you don't have to waste time traveling and all the expense that comes from that. And it's been insightful from someone who has written, has sort of shaped the history of the Cold War. To offer your thoughts on, people have blithely, put out that it's Cold War 2.0 or Cold War 2, but actually there are differences, and there are unique differences to the case in China, with China and with the Soviet Union, and certainly to provide those insights, it's a real opportunity from someone who has sort of lived the Cold War and has shaped the history of the Cold War. So that's a unique opportunity, and so we're very grateful for that as well. Thank you very much.
Sebastian, it was fun to do it. Had a good time. So thanks to all for attending and for your questions.
Brilliant. Well, thanks everyone. And obviously keep posted for following events from our society. We have actually on Monday, we have Andrew Preston talking about the US election. And on Thursday, we have Paul Jankowski, who's talking about his latest book, All Against All, which is on the origins of the Second World War. And we also have future events with Kiran Klaus Patel, the German historian, on the history of European integration as well. So brilliant. Well, thanks very much, John, and thank you all for turning up.
Okay, thank you.
Brilliant.